All right, welcome guys, thank you. So, before we get started, but I want to do some crowd work here. So, this half is going to be left, this is right. I want to hear some noise from the left. Woo! All right, we're competing with the right. Come on, let's go! And all together, I want a symphony. Bring it up! And now just the Polish guys! Woo! There we go. Okay, cool. I love those guys. All right, so we're going to be talking about patterns for making accessible components. What does that mean? We'll look at that. So I'm going to be breaking down just some components that I've compiled together. These are all good examples or best practices of accessibility for different types of components. We're just going to go through each line and basically just talk about them. But before I do that, I kind of want to talk about the inspiration, why I actually decided to do this in particular. So we all love component libraries. When I go to build, and I think when most of you guys go to build, you're using a component library because it makes it so much easier. I wouldn't want to live without Tailwind CSS, honestly. But sometimes, whether it's because we have a custom situation, we have something that doesn't necessarily work with the component library we're using, we sometimes have to branch out and make our own components. And I find myself, probably like many, just staring at an empty div, wondering how I get this into a tabs or a drop-down that actually looks nice and works nice. So I'm going to talk about some techniques when we're making our own so that it's accessible. And this is basically my step through of when I'm making a component. So I always start with accessibility first because it should always be one of your first concerns. I go down to visual design so that it looks nice and I don't put it off before, because I will if not. We go down to the logic, and then of course testing. As we've heard from so many people here today, testing is very, very important. And then a lot of times restart, because I read the memo wrong and it is not actually what I was supposed to be building. All right, so, and I'm going to narrow the scope just a little bit here because there's lots of assistive devices. What I'm going to be talking about in terms of accessibility today, and when I refer to accessibility, it's going to be about screen readers, keyboard access, and speech input software. There are many, many other things to plan for, but I find with code especially, it's usually these three that are not necessarily the hardest, but they're the ones that you want to think about first. So, how do we actually build accessible components for devices? When I started in accessibility, I didn't exactly know what making something accessible was. I kind of heard it and I was like, I thought it was a buzz term almost. But the way that we actually insert accessibility and make these components usable for these different devices is we have two techniques. We have two things that we add. We add HTML elements, obviously, and we add ARIA attributes. The HTML elements, what makes it so powerful is using the native elements. We have lots that we know, like divs, lists, all that kind of stuff, but there's almost 100, I want to say, tags, and they can be really, really specific down to address or line break and all that stuff, and it's best to use the closest HTML tag that you can, something that describes it the most accurately. Sometimes there's not an HTML tag for what you're looking for, so what you can do is you can use ARIA attributes. ARIA attributes are a way to add extra accessibility in if you don't have an HTML element, or if you have some sort of custom behavior. If you're making a crazy new type of user input, like a 3D color picker or something, if it's something brand new and there's no support in HTML, and you think you know how to do it with ARIA, that is the way to do it. And we're going to be going over a lot with ARIA. So, components. We're going to jump into it in 1 second, but I do want to note these components that I picked, it's only a couple, but I picked these because I see them very often, even in component libraries sometimes, where they're pretty accessible. It reads well off of a screen reader, but there's a couple things that could be better. And there's some of these that I see that are wrong each time, and I'd really like to see improved. And so this is me kind of scratching the itch that I've had for a couple years now. But I hope you guys enjoy. Ooh, slip that back on. All right, so first one is a breadcrumb. Really simple, just to get us started. Most times breadcrumbs are pretty accurate. It's pretty simple. It's just link tags, basically. But it is good to have a little bit of structure to them. So if we're starting here, we're going to start with the nav tag. The nav tag is important because our breadcrumb, it is technically a navigation. So we want to have that nav tag. We have an ARIA label on there so that when the screen reader comes over it, it's going to read it off and they're going to know the context. Because we kind of get it based off of the visual appearance, but they, with anybody using screen readers, might not necessarily know the context. You could have a label on top of this as well and use ARIA label by, but most breadcrumbs don't have an extra label up on there, but it's purely design choice. Then we also have a class that's just for a class. We're using an ordered list here because in this context anyway, the hierarchy matters, the order of our elements matters. We have our LI elements, and then inside we have our actual links. There's nothing special about all of these guys. These are just normal links to different pages. But there is one thing I want to notice here that's down on the, oh, I got a laser. That's down here, the ARIA current page. This is super important. As I think another speaker mentioned, there's sometimes when the last element in a breadcrumb, the current page, is sometimes omitted and sometimes included. And both ways, it's good to know when you're on the current page. So if you're ever making a breadcrumb, make sure that you are marking what your current page is, because otherwise it can be very confusing when you're using a screen reader. I got a little example here. It's just, let's see if we can go over here. I'm literally just being able to tab through it. This is default styles, default everything. But it just shows we're able to jump around. And I would hit enter on this, but I actually don't know where the links go, so we're not going to do that. All right, moving on. We are losing focus. There we go. Focus is back. Toasts. Toasts are one of my favorite elements to put together. They're just fun. They just pop up. They help users. And they're in almost every application that you build, or at least that I build. Most times, toast libraries are good. And there's very few times I've run into having to make a custom toast. But when I have, I didn't know how to do it. How do you get something to immediately display to the user? And the answer to that is ARIA live regions and role status. So just starting from the top then, we have a section here. A section is just basically the same semantic value as a div, but it's a more generic way to group content together. I think of it as just a fancy div. It's just a div. Down here we have our actual toast, which is the div. There is no toast element, or there was, but it kind of didn't really make it to the standardization level. So we have to use a div, and we're going to use role status. When we put role status on our div, on any element really, it's going to read off all of the contents. And when I say all the contents, I mean whatever you put in there, even if it's not proper text, if it's just random characters, it will read it off, which is something to keep in mind. You got to be careful with what's in there. And the reason, actually, I'm going to jump down here for a second to the button element. So for this is just for usability and for just general ergonomics. We have an X button that we can use to dismiss it early if we want. Usually most toasts will fade away, so you don't need it. But I find a lot of users like to be able to just get out of it if it's blocking their view. However, because of the role status and because it reads everything off, we have to be careful with that, and we're actually, it seems counterintuitive, but we're going to hide the button completely from the accessibility tree. We're going to do that so that nobody has to deal with it, and they don't have to worry about why this is being read off, why the letter X is being read off. And also, if you're designing it right, it should fade away. I have seen some applications where the toast does not fade away, but I would highly suggest you have one that fades away. I'm still doing good for time. All right, and just another GIF of, all right, tabs. So tabs is the meat and potatoes. I always forget how to do tabs every single time. I think I've done it about 10 times and I forget it. And this is actually just a little bit of terminology before we get into it. This is more for me more than you, so that you know when I'm saying it wrong, because I will say it wrong. But just to get everything straight, so the tab or tab list are the actual buttons that we click on there, and then the tab panels are the content areas that are going to change and show and hide our content. I get this wrong every time, but we're going to try this time. All right, so for the tab list, we have an unordered list. The hierarchy doesn't really matter here, so it's unordered. We have LI elements. So we have LI elements, but we have role presentation on there. Role presentation is another one that might seem counterintuitive if you've worked with ARIA roles before, because it actually takes away the semantic value of an LI. It's still an LI element to the browser, so it'll pass HTML validation, but to the accessibility tree, that's basically making it a div. The reason we want to make it a pseudo div, if you will, is because when the screen reader comes over it, there is a little pre-ramble that goes before that says item element number 1, and then it talks about the link. And while that's good for most use cases, I've talked to a lot of people that use screen readers, and when they're trying to find information on a page and they're going through pages and pages and pages of links, having just that extra time in front of every single link can actually take a lot out of their day. So it's highly suggested that you either just use a div of just plain links, which feels bad, but that is what the suggestion is, or you can do a list like this, and you can have role presentation on there. Now for actual links for the tab list, it's just a link to inside the page, and this is going to link to our actual tab panels. We have role tabs, so that works together with the role of tab list. And then we have an ID on there. We're going to use the ID to reference it later in our HTML. And then we have tab index set to -1. And I want you to think about that, and I'm not going to explain it, but we'll explain it later. All right, so for our actual tab panels, we have sections, and then these sections have IDs. We have role of tab panel, label by, that's where we're referencing our IDs, and then ARIA hidden. And we have this for each of our panels. So we need a mechanism for switching our tabs. So I'm using a vanilla just for this, because if I did React, it actually would have filled up 2 lengths of this slide. But with this, what we want to do is, all we're doing is just writing a function to switch over the next tabs, moving over the elements. So we're setting the tab index to 0 on the currently selected one. We're setting the ARIA selected to true or false, whether it is the selected one. And we're setting attributes to defaults and hiding the panels. And this is the full one. And the reason we're doing that, the reason we're, the important part I said before about the index, that is because it's highly suggested that instead of using tabs to go through all over the tab lists, which it's in the name, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but there's instances where you might have tabs components where there's 70, 80 tabs. It's an edge case, but it does happen, and if there's too many, the user has to tab through every single one of those tabs before they get there. So what we're doing is we're setting it up so we can use arrow keys. So I am just about done, so I just want to skip to the end and just say one note about testing. There is a couple ways to test. We can do automated testing with programs like Lighthouse, manual testing if you would like to learn about a screen reader and how to use it. But a really weird way that I learned that's helped me a lot is to actually disable the CSS. When you disable the CSS on a web page, you're seeing more of an accurate view of what the screen reader sees. It disorganizes the content the way that you've organized it, and it just allows you to get a better feel for what the screen reader is going to use without having to learn how to use a screen reader. So I think that is all my time. Accessibility is hard. Continue with it. It is worth it, and it's good to see so many talks out here. And that is me. That's my time. Thank you, guys. All right. I got the slides, and if anybody wants to take a look at them, they will be on there until slides.com is no longer freemium. But yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. All right, thanks, guys.